Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are around the world. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service, and it is great to have you here for another edition of our Fast Break series, engaging in the issues that are dominating the headlines. We're really pleased today to have with us Professor Abe Newman. Abraham Newman is the newly named John Powers Chair in International Business Diplomacy. He's also the director of our BMW Center on German-European relations. He's an expert and a specialist on international political economy. And his most recent, among many, many publications, is a widely read and widely praised book called Underground Empire, which was named one of the best books by the Financial Times, by The Economist, by Foreign Policy magazine, Foreign Affairs magazine. So he comes off a really, I think, an important set of research questions that are engaging in the future of Europe, the transatlantic relationship in a moment of extraordinary change. And indeed, what a moment we are in. And that's what we want to talk about today, Europe as a crossroads. So let me begin. And just to let those of us who are new to the series, I will be monitoring the Q&A function throughout the course of the conversation. And I will try as best I can to integrate some of the questions into the conversation that I'll begin with Professor Newman. So if you have questions, throw them into the chat. I won't be identifying individuals by name, but I will try to meld and integrate them into our conversation. But let's start with the big question. In the last few weeks, given the Trump turnaround on some key issues regarding our relationship with Europe and our support in Ukraine, we have seen, I have, or I should say, I have never seen rhetoric on the level that we have heard in the last few weeks. We heard from President Trump saying that the EU was formed, quote, to screw the United States. We have heard in response noted commentators like Martin Wolf in the FT just the other day calling this a truly historic catastrophe. He said it looks like the 1930s with the U.S. on the wrong side. He said clearly the U.S. is no longer a proponent and defender of liberal democracy. We've seen on the political side, President Macron say that the continent faces what he said were irreversible changes from the United States. And we've heard the incoming chancellor in Germany, Merz, say that the goal is now to achieve independence from the United States. And he said, and I quote, the U.S. is largely indifferent to the fate of Europe. This is extraordinary rhetoric. Help us understand how significant this change is in the transatlantic relationship. Is it hyperbole? Is there a lot behind this hype? Give us a sort of a level set of where you think the situation actually is in terms of the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So I do not think it is hype, and I do think that there is basically an underlying tear in what we would have called the Atlantic Order. So, since for about 100 years, there have been an assumption that the economic and security interests, whatever the form it took, whether it was through NATO or trade agreements or whatever those things were, that these two groups, these partners, were working hand in hand and could assume that the one would benefit from the actions of the other. And I think what we're seeing right now is the deterioration of that order, in the sense that Europe is not just concerned that the U.S. is not a credible partner or that the U.S. has different interests, because that's happened before, but that actually the United States might undermine and target U.S. or European interests and become a threat to its objectives. And all those quotes that you've seen, this isn't just burden sharing or a rebalancing. These are ones where these states are fearful that they could be targeted by the United States. And we've seen that the U.S. administration has made these threats quite apparent, whether it's to Greenland or to trade tariffs, or the president's own statements that the European Union is just made there to screw us. So I think the whole conversation we just have to have with the underpinning that in Europe right now, there is a deep almost like how COVID hit, it decenters what people's just everyday given expectation. In the transatlantic relationship, there was just, if we were doing market activity, if we were doing security activity, there was an underpinning kind of set of cues, standard practices, procedures that people just assumed were there. And those things have now gone away. And actors are scrambling to figure out in this confusion what their position should be.
Now, of course, there's a counter argument around many of the things associated with the Trump administration and Trump personally, that the rhetoric that he uses, the heightened rhetoric, the hyperbole, is, perhaps strategic to push European nations to do something that multiple administrations have been pushing them to do. And you mentioned this with the rebalancing necessary on European security. We know that the Europeans have not been spending, and there has been a clear admission of this, nearly enough on their own defense. The threat from Russia has highlighted that even more. We know that there are kind of fundamental issues in the nature of the transatlantic relationship that have not been addressed. And this heightened rhetoric is a way of finally breaking that stalemate and getting Europe to address some of the fundamental issues it needs to about its own security, not to mention, and we can talk about its own integration and the effectiveness of its integration. How do you respond to that argument?
Yeah, I think if you were going down that path, then you would see a place where Europe would increase spending on defense, and that would be those increases in spending would be integrated into a transatlantic security architecture. And I think if you just look at some very simple statistics of over the last few weeks, what you see instead is Europe is going to spend more money on its defense, but not within the context of a transatlantic security architecture. So if you compare the stock prices of Rheinmetall, which is a large German military producer, and Lockheed Martin, you've basically seen Rheinmetall's stock has gone up over 100% since the beginning of the year, and Lockheed Martin's stock has gone down in that same period. And that's really crazy for the transatlantic relationship, because even Rheinmetall, it doesn't produce most of the things that we usually think of as the transatlantic security architecture. And when European spending has gone up, it's benefited U.S. Producers. And so what I think you're seeing is a decoupling of the mindset of what is the U.S.-European relationship. And so even if we see European spending go up, it is now hedging against that it needs to be independent of the United States. And so I don't think that's in the US interests. I don't think it's in the European interests either. And so I think we have to just see that there's something much more fundamental happening in this relationship than just rebalancing of spending.
Well, let's get to that point about the European interest. Gideon Rockman and the FT made, an interesting argument that, and obviously playing on the language, saying Trump is making Europe great again. And his argument is that this precisely the decoupling that you described, precisely the need to make serious investments in European security with European firms in a common European framework is actually going to be a boon, I should say, to European integration, a boon to European spending, and could provide a Keynesian boost to the European economies as they, make the kind of significant investments that have been discussed. We've had long-standing issues with regard to European fiscal policy and the extent to which Germany's position, in particular, on fiscal position on debt, has kind of impacted the kind of investments that need to be made. These things, although they are, as you say, damaging to the U.S. European relationship, do they have these unintended benefits that could be a boost to the European economies and a boost to European integration?
Well, let me just start by saying that I think this is one of the biggest tragedies that could befall modern civilization. The transatlantic relationship is a trillion-dollar economic activity. It has been a relationship that has underpinned democracy for decades. It's something that has created untold amounts of innovation across these two areas. And so the idea that there would be a fundamental rupture between the two, I don't think anybody can say that it's going to be great and that it's going to make anything great again. I think the the second point that you make is that it, in the short term, will create changes that could benefit Europe's economy by driving increased spending. And I think that that's true. And I think in particular for Germany, it could be very useful because the German economic model had kind of run its course. Its auto industry was suffering in foreign markets, particularly China. And so the idea that it would, turn and pivot towards the production of military equipment, will drive that economy and will lead to growth that probably people had not anticipated for Germany. But I also want to stress that what we're seeing right now in this rapid transformation, which I think is it's necessary. Europe has to reconfigure both its economic architecture and its security architecture. But in doing that, I think we're going to see huge strains on the European Union itself, because the solutions that are being imposed, whether it's Germany's proposed spending plan or the peacekeeping force that's being proposed for Ukraine, those things are going to be largely outside of the EU institutional rules. And because of the way the EU is constructed, they're kind of tearing apart of those. So the peacekeeping force, it has to avoid Hungary because Hungary will not comply with that. So it's going to create some kind of a la carte model there. And Germany's spending plans will go outside of the EU budget, and they will be largely, an individual country doing a tremendous amount of state aid, of pumping money into it, which then the other countries will just have to figure out, are they part of that? Will there be some spillover to their economies, or will it undermine their competitiveness? And so while there is, I think in the short term, we see some, it is a shock to the system that will lead to some benefits. In the long term, it's going to raise a lot of questions for Europe itself.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the fiscal issues, and then we're going to actually get to the integrated security issues. And I do want to ask some questions about the divisions within Europe that you alluded to. But first, on the fiscal side, you talked about Germany, really a structural sort of shift in German fiscal policy. Where do you think the defense spending is going to go? Is it going to go above, well above the 2% range? And in particular, how do you think it's going to impact? You mentioned the other countries across Europe. We talked a little bit about what Germany is going to do. What do you think this means for kind of fiscal budgetary policy across Europe in individual states as they react to a sort of a very significant shift in Germany?
Well, I mean, I think Germany for many years was one of the few countries that really stayed within like the fiscal constraints that the EU proposed. And so in this way, it will be a loosening of those, but many of the other countries had already loosened their own fiscal constraints. I think the bigger issue is that you're going to see, hundreds of billions of dollars being put into the German economy, both for military, but a large part of the package is also for infrastructure. And those things will, in some places, benefit European partners, Leopold or different military providers, BEA in the UK. But at the same time, it is going to cause a disparity in the growth rates between the markets, because Germany is going to grow faster than these other countries, and they don't have the bazooka. Just when you think about the size of Germany's economy compared to Portugal, it's just not. It can't keep up with that kind of Keynesian spending. So I think you will see, inflationary pressures in parts of the country. It'll cause weird adjustments on interest rates. So over the long term, I think it's going to create a lot of disequilibriums amongst the member states.
And what does that mean for the European Union and the Brussels bureaucracy and, the effort to kind of create an integrated European policy at a time when you're going to get these kind of differential economic, and we haven't even begun to touch yet about the different security contributions that are going to be made to any kind of common security force. Is this threatening in some way the coherence of the European Union as an entity, as opposed to the individual behaviors of the UK and now outside the European Union, France and Germany, who are going to be the major players in any security arrangements as well as any economic arrangements?
I mean, I think you just have to recognize the scale of the crisis that is happening to Europe. And so I think the European Union is largely on board with these changes. Europe is facing a place right now where it has to deal with economic concerns coming from China. It has a war on the continent that Russia is pursuing against Ukraine, and its U.S. partner, which provided its largest security guarantee and its largest economic partner, has done an about face. And the U.S. is increasingly sympathetic towards Russia's position on the world stage. If you just look up the UN votes, the U.S. is voting with China, or sorry, not China, with Russia on the Ukraine position. And so for the EU, it has to take radical action. It has to pull itself up by its bootstraps. And what you're seeing is that the EU institutions are willing to be flexible. And I think that that's a very important, Europe is one of the largest economies in the world. It has hundreds of millions of citizens. It has the capabilities and the economy to respond to this kind of a challenge, but it's going to require flexibility within the EU and institutions itself. I just think we shouldn't be naive to think that that won't have long-term consequences for the way the EU functions going forward.
Now, there have been several questions about the resurgence of the right, and indeed even the extreme right within several European countries. The interesting position that Meloni has in Italy, being kind of really moving from what some might have seen as the extreme right into kind of the core of engagement across Europe. What do you see these tremendous shifts having on the dynamics of the growth of the right across Europe, and in particular the extreme right?
I think that there's, you kind of have a push-pull. So the Trump administration is legitimizing far-right parties in Europe and is actively working to support them. So, Musk's effort to support the AfD, you have similar types of ties to many of the far-right parties in Europe. But I think at the same time, you do see a rallying around the center in which people are in the center are worried about this legitimization of the far right, and they're working to minimize it. I also think if you just look at the polls, there was a Guardian poll recently, neither Musk or Trump are very popular in many European countries and increasingly are viewed as a threat to European security. And so I think it's a different game than the 2016 or the first Trump administration, where really he had very few actions that implicated international affairs. There was a lot of bluster, but not a lot of actual action. But between the Vance speech at the Munich Security Conference and the dressing down of Zelensky in the White House, European allies have understood or taken the message that this administration is willing to undermine fundamental European objectives for these far-right preferences. And so they're not willing to continue to expose themselves, and they're taking actions to protect themselves.
There have been a few questions about what's driving the U.S. behavior on this, right? As you said, in Trump 1, there was a lot of bluster, but not a lot of action. What we're seeing in Trump 2 is much more concerted action, quote unquote, effective action in the sense of moving from rhetoric to action. Who do you think, who is driving the understanding of a new transatlantic relationship? Is there an intellectual core or foundation that is kind of given or essentially strengthened the action as opposed to the rhetoric? Or is this really just a kind of function of, the personal predilections of Trump, who, as he himself has said, always believed that Europe is screwing the United States? I mean, is there something more behind this that is driving the U.S. policy on the transatlantic relationship?
Yes, I think that you have, on the one hand, there's a group that existed across both Trump administrations and was also there in the Obama administration, which was more kind of a China hawk group. It's a more conventional faction that sees a need to recalibrate from Europe to Asia. And I think if that group was primarily driving what was happening, it would be in line with what Europeans would have expected and with the kind of burden-sharing conversation that we were familiar with. What is different is really, I think, two different other factions which have ascended. One of them is part of the kind of the illiberal group that supports far-right parties across the world. And this is part of the, there's been increasing coordination between actors in Hungary, in Turkey, in Israel, in the United States, that view of future world is one where the basic kind of liberal international order is not part of their objective. And their objective is one that's much more nationalist and revanchist. It's one where you threaten states and you seek territorial domination. And so you should see the threats against Canada or Greenland or Panama. Those are very much in line with Russian threats against Crimea, Ukraine. It's the same idea of that there is a larger, we're not in a world constrained by sovereignty, but we should seek to dominate. And that has created, I think, a sympathy between Russia and the United States, which is not just about Trump. That, I think you hear Vance and Musk making the same set of arguments. There was recently an exchange, a really mind-blowing exchange between Musk and a former Polish official, where the Polish official was saying, we're paying for Starlink in Ukraine. What more do you want? And Musk just says, "Sit down, old man." Some kind of dismissive comment. And I think those kinds of interactions are not based in the China hawk, the traditional rebalancing conversation. It's really in a place where the liberal order about markets and contracts are gone, and we're really more about this other world. And the final thing I just want to say is that we shouldn't just think this is a Trump phenomenon. I think a lot of people in Europe were hoping for that in the previous administration, that, if Trump was gone, that would return to some set point in relationships. But I think you're seeing a much broader diffusion of these ideas within the Republican Party. And so I think Europe has rightly come to acknowledge that this is something that they have to see as a strain. It doesn't have to be the only strain in American politics, but one that they have to be prepared for, even in a post-Trump world.
Well, there have been several questions asking sort of what happens beyond Trump. Assuming in our democracy, we shift significantly often from one election to the next. What are the possibilities, and how should we think about repairing perhaps some of the damage in the nature of the transatlantic relationship? What's possible and what's not possible? And how should we be kind of thinking about the long-term nature of this relationship, regardless of what happens in the next couple of years?
I mean, I think one of the most important things is that businesses and civil society, they need to continue to think of themselves as global and not just domestic. I think it's very disconcerting when U.S. companies align themselves so closely with the U.S. administration that then undermines their credibility in foreign markets. And so we've had in the last few weeks multiple incidents where Starlink has been used, for example, as a leverage vis-a-vis Ukraine, that, if Ukraine doesn't come to the table, they won't get Starlink services. And even though you might think that's just a Musk phenomena, it's very easy for Europeans then to say, well, what's safe? When should we partner with US firms, whether that's Facebook or Google or Lockheed Martin? There was recently the US government said it was going to stop updating F-16 software for Ukrainian Air Force. And it's a similar thing where it's not just about what the government does and what Trump does, but it is also about what do our firms do and how reliable are they as partners. And I think it's really important for the leaders in the business community to be speaking to other transatlantic partners and saying, we are going to continue our interactions and we are going to deepen them. And in many ways, it's kind of just like what we would talk about two-track diplomacy, back in the Cold War, is that you need partnerships at the university level, in civil society, at the corporate level, to have some basis of trust for, once the most severe frictions are over, to rebuild.
And, in terms of Europe and kind of where Europe goes from here and how Europe sees this, look, to what extent is this and especially in terms of thinking about the threat that Russia poses to Europe and the potential effectiveness of a response to support Ukraine. Um, to what extent is this, though, really kind of creating a dynamic in which there might be a stronger response, a more effective response to Russia's aggression on the European continent? And, it does seem to be adding a dynamism to Germany, adding a dynamism even to the French, and the fascinating situation, and someone asked about it earlier, of the UK, bringing the UK back into a dialogue with other major European powers, so that the major European powers are actually, taking a stronger engagement and responsibility for the future of European security. Where does that go, and does that provide potentially a more effective response to Russian aggression?
Yes, I mean, I have been screaming at my European colleagues for about 6 months saying, you have this window right now. Russia has been exposed as, militarily incompetent. They were supposed to be the best military in the world, and they can't even move the line in Ukraine. And so they're exhausted. Their economy is in ruins. And so Europe has about 10 years now before Russia can rebuild and really be a threat to the core of European security interests. And so if this is the moment when the US recedes and moves away, Europe has an opportunity. And they have, I think, right now shown that they're moving in that direction, with Germany's economic plan, with the UK and its military cooperation with the rest of Europe. But I also I don't want people to leave thinking that it's a good idea for this rift between Europe and the United States to happen. Yes, Germany is stepping up, and the UK has these military capabilities, but ultimately, our economies are so intertwined. It is going to have long-term consequences, not just for Europe, but for us. We are going to lose out on business. Our citizens are not going to be able to move back and forth as easily into Europe. And we are going to, suffer as the transatlantic relationship degrades. So I think it is an opportunity right now for Europe, and it should seize that. But at the same time, we should be doing everything in our power to stand up for the transatlantic relationship and make sure that it is rebuilt to what it was, because it's such a dynamic and economically successful relationship.
Can you talk a little bit in the final minutes about just the economic relationship and how it's likely to be impacted by this change? Because you mentioned the issues that this has raised with Brussels, and Brussels control and regulatory control over the EU space. Obviously, one aspect of the transatlantic relationship was the differential regulatory environments across the two continents. Where do you kind of see the economic relationship going? Does Brussels sort of change as an entity as a result of the increasing engagement and power of the dominant powers within Europe, Germany, France, and UK outside of the EU? How does that relationship change? And talk a little bit more about how you see the economic relationship across the two continents developing.
Yes, I mean, I think the between the tariffs and the increasing, let's say, regulatory attacks that the US is placing on Europe, Europe is likely going to circle its wagons and try to protect itself in a place where the partner has turned to be an adversary. I think there is internal efforts within Europe in order to create more market dynamism, those kinds of the kind of reforms that been on the table by the internal market project, reforms. That being said, I think you're seeing a new kind of discourse emerge in Europe, which is seeing European regulation not just as a competitiveness issue, but also as a national security issue. And so when you think about the tech firms and how Europe was thinking about companies like Facebook or Twitter, it saw them as about level playing field, about how do we create a dynamic market in Europe that can compete with these firms. But in the last month, you've seen a number of very senior European officials. Pedro Sanchez was probably the most notable. He's the Prime Minister of Spain. say these companies aren't just about level playing field, they are a national security threat. These companies do not share our preferences and are injecting campaign misinformation into our political systems. And so we have to protect ourselves, not just to create an economic market, but also to create a national security a benefit. And that's just a conversation you wouldn't have heard in Europe a few years ago. And if it continues, a whole range of US firms are going to be under that scrutiny in Europe in a new way, which I think is not where we should be moving.
Can you just elaborate for one last minute on that? Because it's interesting to mention that this rift has added a whole new element of the economic relationship by bringing national security into the regulation of the economic relationship. Where do you think that's going to have an impact on economic relations across the continent?
I mean, you're seeing it right now just in the most critical interactions. So there's been several conversations about Starlink contracts in Italy and other countries. European satellite operators have been saying that they will ramp up, their ability to provide services. You see this, like I was mentioning, in the military industrial complex. The fall in orders for U.S. companies and the rise in orders from various U.S. or European firms. And I think that there's no doubt that in the big tech sector, this is already happening. I think my concern is, when does it start to bleed over into other, what we would have thought of as not sensitive sectors? So like banking, as banking was a pretty global market, we would have thought of that as highly integrated. But if countries start to think that financial informations and financial flows are putting them at risk, you could easily see people put in similar restrictions on who can use what banks and why. So I think we should be worried and thinking broadly about how a national security element to the transatlantic relationship could degrade a broad set of economic interactions.
Well, we're going to have to stop there, and I want to recommend to our listeners that Abe's book, Underground Empire, it really delves into this core set of issues about the changing economic relationship due to changes in technology, what that means for U.S. and European relationships, and the intermingling of economic security and economic regulatory issues. So if you want to learn more about it, I urge you to look at Abe's new book, as well as his numerous writings across multiple venues, because you'll see him in the news often through op-eds and others. We're really pleased to have you here, Abe. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, our SFS listeners. I have to say that we had hoped, or we had planned this to be an occasional series, but given the fact that every day there seems to be yet another earth-shattering change in the global order, we seem to be having these more and more, but we will continue as events do call. These recordings, these dialogues are recorded. They are on our YouTube channel. All of the dialogues that we've had, the SFS Fast Break dialogues, you can share them with other alumni and friends. So I encourage you to look and have a deeper dive into some of our conversations. Thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to the next SFS Fast Break in this remarkably, extraordinarily exciting and challenging global moment. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Joel.